Time for a story. This book, Clara's Spy Adventure. Clara was a curious girl who lived in a quiet neighborhood. One day she noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Smith, acting suspiciously. She would always look around before entering her house and never spoke to anyone. Clara's curiosity got the best of her, and she decided to spy on Mrs. Smith. She grabbed her binoculars and hid behind a bush, watching Mrs. Smith's every move. She felt like a real spy. As Clara was spying, she saw Mrs. Smith talking to a group of men in black suits. She was convinced that Mrs. Smith was up to no good. But in a funny twist, Mrs. Smith noticed Clara and invited her inside her house. Inside, Mrs. Smith revealed that she was actually an undercover police officer. She was investigating a group of criminals who were planning to rob a nearby bank. Mrs. Smith needed Clara's help to stop them. Mrs. Smith explained that the criminals were planning to rob the bank the next day. Clara was excited to be a part of a real-life spy mission. They came up with a plan to catch the criminals in the act. The next day, Clara and Mrs. Smith went to the bank and waited for the criminals to arrive. But suddenly, a group of thugs appeared and tried to stop them. Clara was scared, but Mrs. Smith told her to stay calm and trust in their plan. As they were trying to escape the thugs, Clara remembered a riddle her grandfather had told her. She quickly solved it, and it led them to a secret passage that led to the bank's vault. Inside the vault, they found the criminals trying to break into the safe. Clara and Mrs. Smith surprised them, and a fight broke out. Clara used her quick thinking and helped Mrs. Smith defeat the criminals. With the criminals caught, Clara and Mrs. Smith were hailed as heroes. Clara's parents were proud of her, and she felt like a real spy. Mrs. Smith thanked Clara for her bravery and promised to take her on more adventures in the future. As Clara returned home, she realized that she was no longer an ordinary girl. She had gone on a thrilling adventure and helped catch criminals. She had overcome her fear of Mrs. Smith and had become a hero. From that day on, Clara was known as the neighborhood spy. Story's over, but your adventure doesn't have to be. Hit save to keep your tale or wave it goodbye. Dive into our YouTube and public library for more creations. The end or just the beginning.